He was a kid from the Wild West who fell in love with airplanes at the ripe old age of 4.5. At the age of 15, he drove halfway across the country to enroll in a cut-rate aviation school. And by the time he was 16, he'd built and flown his own airplane. He built an enormous business training pilots, took time out to personally fly in World War II, and then came back home to build his business even more. He helped design the air traffic control system that enabled aviation's enormous growth in the 1960s, helped get the American space program off the ground, and gave refuge to the first man to walk on the moon. At a time when his peers were retiring, he stepped in to save one of aviation's legendary manufacturers. And when he was done with that, he began a new career as a writer. He is Harry Combs, and he is a legend of Airpower. Harry Benjamin Combs was born in Denver, Colorado on January 27, 1913. He was raised by his father and grandmother, but his life changed when he was barely 4 years old. That was when his father, after watching what became World War I building in Europe, decided he wanted to become a military pilot.
One day, I came in and the nurse who had said, "You better go see your grandmother. She wants to see you very much." And I went in to see her. I called her Gamma. And she said, she was crying. I'd never seen her. You know, she was a stately lady. And I'd never seen her weep, you know, or anything like that, or be disturbed about anything. But she was crying. And I said, "What's going on, Gamma?" I called her Gamma. And she said, "Daddy's going to war. Your daddy is going to war."
The United States wasn't involved in the war yet, so the elder Combs packed up and went to Canada, where he enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Not long after, Combs and his grandmother boarded a train to visit Combs' father in Toronto. The train ride was an epic journey for the young Combs. He slept in an upper berth and watched the countryside pass through the train's windows. The aerodrome in Deseronto, east of Toronto, near the north shore of Lake Ontario, was, like most aerodromes of its day, little more than a grass field with a swarm of biplanes trundling along the ground. Combs was impressed to see his father in uniform and almost overwhelmed with all the activity. He watched in fascination as the planes took off and landed.
I remember a great deal of it, and excitement, I watched these machines run along the ground and then rise in the air. How do they do that? And my interest in aviation started right there.
Combs' father, seeing the boy's fascination, used a paper airplane to illustrate the fundamentals of aerodynamics. All the way home, all Combs could talk about was the airplanes and flight and the pilots he'd seen and met. He attended the Taft Prep School in Connecticut. He decorated his dorm room with pictures of the great flyers of his time. He wanted to learn to fly more than anything else in the world. But in those days, flight training was rare and very expensive. On a trip back to Colorado, he and a friend paid $5 for a brief ride in a mail plane.
That was an experience. I never forget it. The airplane gaining speed and the earth going by and then suddenly lifting off. And I God, this is for me. This is for me. And I can't do anything else, but then I was nutty about it.
Back at school, Combs couldn't get his mind off learning to fly. In those days of barnstormers and air races, being an aviator was like being a rock star. Lindbergh had flown to Paris and returned the world's most famous man. Newspapers almost daily carried stories of new records broken and new aircraft flown. Combs was nearly bursting with a desire to fly. And one day, he picked up a magazine and found a solution to his problem.
I discovered in a magazine an advertisement, $99, learn to fly. And in those days, there were no little Piper Cubs and so forth that you could fly economically like you can now. There were always war surplus, and there were biplanes, big, used up a lot of fuel and so forth. So a thing like this was unbelievable. But it was at Lindbergh's old school.
Which meant, of course, that the $99 flight course was in St. Louis, Lindbergh's hometown. The fact that Combs was in Connecticut posed only a minor problem. He convinced his flight-mad roommate, who had a car, that they should drive out to St. Louis and learn to fly, which they did. And after only 3 hours and 13 minutes of instruction, Combs soloed, a 15-year-old kid who lied about his age, taking off into the wild blue yonder.
When Harry Combs was 16, the world was a little different place than it is now. Young boys didn't have Nintendo, they didn't have television sets, they barely had movie theaters, and they worked a lot more with their hands and with building things. It really wasn't illogical for a 16-year-old who was mesmerized by flight to decide to build an airplane.
Harry and a friend designed and built a sport biplane, which they christened the Vamp Bat. It had a Jacobs radial engine and, remarkably, flew just beautifully. For the next 2 years, Combs flew the plane every chance he got, until in 1931, a gust of wind flipped the plane on a taxiway in Pueblo, Colorado. Combs went to Yale University, where he received his degree in applied economics. Still wanting to be part of the aviation world, he took a job as a ticket clerk for Pan American Airways. Pan Am at the time was the most glamorous airline in the world, with routes stretching farther than any other airline and a fleet of aircraft reminiscent of the great clipper ships of the high seas. He roomed with a couple of college friends in New York, scraping by on his $50 a month salary, and just missed meeting Charles Lindbergh one morning in the Pan Am offices. Combs got a $1,000 graduation present from a rich uncle, and he teamed up with a friend to buy a Warner Fleet biplane. Still, fuel was expensive for someone making $12.50 a week, so Combs was still scratching for flight time. A friend of Combs' girlfriend convinced him to move back to Denver to work in investment banking, and almost as soon as Combs arrived, he was scrounging around for flight time. He joined the Colorado National Guard, which had a small flight operation, and swaggered onto the field to see if he could get a little stick time. The officers laughed, and while planes took off and landed in the background, handed Combs a broom and told him to sweep the hangar. Soon enough, however, Combs was flying in 019 and building up his hours. He earned his instructor rating and discovered that he liked teaching others to fly. In fact, he liked it so much that he quit his job at the bank and opened his own flight school. He partnered with a fixed-base operator named Ray Wilson, charging $3 an hour for training and getting 10% of every airplane he sold. They called the venture Mountain State Aviation, and their timing couldn't have been better. Another war was brewing in Europe, and in Washington, planners in the War Department were cooking up a way to get a few thousand pilots trained, just in case. The civilian pilot training program was a stroke of genius. At a time when interest in aviation was high but defense spending low, the government started the program to train civilian pilots who could, if war came, make a relatively quick and easy transition to military flight. Harry Combs' new flight school, Mountain State Aviation, quickly landed a government contract to train pilots. An initial $7,500 investment bloomed into a $300,000 business. As World War II approached, however, Combs couldn't keep himself out of the action, and while his role as a flight instructor would likely have earned him a draft deferment, he enlisted in the Army Air Corps. While he was off flying transports in North Africa and India, his company back home trained more than 9,000 pilots and came close to going broke. Combs came home, and rather than mourning his financial losses, he simply went back to work, rebuilding the school.
A lot of GIs that took their annuity and spent it learning to be pilots, which was good because the airlines were getting plowed up, and they needed pilots.
Combs bought out his partner and renamed the company Combs Aircraft. He expanded it into Wyoming and Montana. He sold what were essentially package deals, teaching people to fly and then selling them aircraft. And by 1958, Combs Aircraft was the largest seller of Beechcraft airplanes in the country. Aviation boomed in the 1950s, and by the end of the decade, it was becoming clear that the industry's growth would be stunted unless a better way of handling traffic in the air could be devised. Newly elected President John Kennedy, impressed by Combs' managerial and administrative skills, tapped the can-do Westerner to help redesign the antiquated air traffic control system. The task force, called Project Beacon, was probably Combs' greatest contribution to the growth of the aviation industry.
Harry was the man who came up with the concept of segregating the airspace by the type of airplane that was flying in it, so you didn't have Piper Cubs competing with 747s in the same airspace.
Segregating aircraft by performance enabled the growth of both commercial and civil aviation. The air traffic control system as it exists today is largely a result of knowledge Combs accrued while teaching hundreds of new pilots how to maneuver in 3 dimensions. His seemingly simple insight, the segregation of aircraft, helped turn aviation from a risky, if glamorous endeavor, into a safe, everyday mode of mass transport.
It was very easy for him to marry the love of aviation and the love of business by going into aviation as a business. Took him a while to perfect it, but once he did, he was absolutely brilliant at it.
As Project Beacon wound down, Combs was hired as a consultant to NASA, the space agency that President Kennedy charged with putting a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. He brought his background in flight training to bear on the problem of astronaut training, and he helped as well in streamlining the agency's procurement and manufacturing processes. By the mid-1960s, Combs seemed to be cutting back on his business activities. He sold Combs Aircraft to Charles Gates of Denver's Gates Rubber Company, but stayed on as a consultant. He convinced Gates to buy Roscoe Turner Aeronautical, forming the highly successful Combs-Gates network of fixed-base operations. And then, in a move that many in the industry considered foolhardy, he convinced Gates to buy Learjet Industries. Based in Wichita, Kansas, Lear was the leader in what was really an embryonic corporate aviation industry. But it was also a company that had lost its way, diversifying into businesses unrelated to aviation, including the manufacture of 8-track tape players for automobiles. Combs convinced Gates that Lear could be returned to profitability, and Gates went along because Combs promised that he would stay close to the project and make sure it maintained its focus. Combs didn't know how close he was going to stay. Soon after Gates acquired Lear, the company's CEO was killed in a car accident. At the age of 58, when Harry Combs' attention was turning to light work schedules and long weeks spent on his beloved Colorado ranch, he instead stepped up and took day-to-day control of a troubled aviation icon. He did it, he said, because he couldn't resist a challenge. And Lear would prove to be a very big challenge indeed. In the late 1960s, the renamed Gates Learjet Company was on the verge of bankruptcy. Though it manufactured a full line of elegant corporate jets that enjoyed a reputation as the apex of jet-age luxury, the company itself was a mess.
Harry Combs had to step in and really rebuild the company from the ground up. He had to create energy and enthusiasm. He had to create airplanes that people wanted and needed, and he had to create a market for them. He had to teach America why they needed small business jets like the Lear.
Combs started with the company's employees, who were discouraged and saw little future for the company. He gathered them together and told them Lear was a good company, but that it was going broke. "We will have to be austere and humble," he told them, "but we're going to be austere with class and humble with pride." He then began the long process of dismantling and reassembling the company. He sold off divisions that weren't relevant to the company's core mission, corporate jets. He scrapped the complicated and expensive system of distributorships, centralizing sales in the home office in Kansas. And he broke down one of the key barriers keeping companies from buying Lear's jets, a shortage of trained pilots and maintenance personnel. In general, pilots and mechanics qualified to fly and work on passenger jets were more likely to take jobs with major airlines, jobs that paid more and had a higher status than working in civil aviation. Thinking back to his days building Combs aircraft, he decided that Lear should sell planes and training as a package. He contracted with Flight Safety International, which established a training center in Wichita. The center was packed with simulators for pilot training and provided maintenance and ground school instruction as well. Companies or individuals that bought Lear jets got not only a plane, but the training it took to operate the planes efficiently and safely. Then he went to work on Lear's product line, developing the Lear Model 35, which was sold as the Longhorn 55. The Longhorn was in many ways the first modern corporate jet. It was roomy and comfortable, with a ceiling of 51,000 feet for cruising in the relatively calm air high above the clouds. It was more fuel efficient, cheaper to operate, and went faster and flew farther.
I think Harry Combs' greatest strength is as a visionary. He's one of those people that has the ability to look at anything and see beyond what's on the surface.
He certainly did that with Gates Lear. In less than a decade, he took a company headed for bankruptcy and turned it into a profitable industry leader. In the process, he made corporate aviation the major business that it is today. While he was building Gates Lear, he remained in touch with NASA, helping out here and there where he could. In 1969, he was invited to Cape Canaveral to watch the launch of Apollo 11, man's first mission to the moon. Accompanied by John Love, the governor of Colorado, he listened to the countdown and marveled at how far aviation had come.
Down to zero and whoom, and you just see that fire burning under this thing, and you begin to see the whole world shakes. I mean, hell, you're 2 miles from where the damn thing is going up, and the ground is shaking all over. And here you see this damn thing climbing, struggling against the gravity of the earth, and a guy's in it. There's 2 or 3 guys in there.
The moonshot, of course, went off without a hitch. turning Neil Armstrong into the biggest aviation hero since Charles Lindbergh. When the astronauts got back, the public interest in them was extreme, and NASA needed a place for Armstrong to relax and unwind with his family.
Now, some NASA public affairs officer had come up with the wonderful idea that they would send Neil to a dude ranch. And somebody else wisely said, we don't want to send Neil Armstrong to a dude ranch. Hey, let's call Harry Combs.
Combs, of course, was perfectly thrilled to host Armstrong and his family. NASA asked Armstrong if he and his family wanted to go to Harry Combs' ranch. Armstrong thought about it for a few seconds and said, yes, I've heard of Harry Combs, that will be fine. Combs, told that Armstrong had heard of him, laughed and had one of his aides call Armstrong back to tell him that Combs had also heard of Armstrong. During 3 weeks on the Combs ranch, the two struck up a fast friendship. They rode horses and wandered the open ranges of Colorado, while the media speculated on what Armstrong was up to.
They were both passionately in love with aviation and space exploration. I think Harry was used to being around people of note, and so he wasn't overwhelmed by Neil. Neil was equally impressed with Harry and with his many achievements, and I think they spent many long hours discussing aviation.
One of the favorite topics of the two was the Wright brothers. Combs had no idea how methodical the Wrights had been in researching aerodynamics and designing their flyer. The discussion spurred Holmes to begin a long research project on the Wrights, and he eventually wrote and published a book, Kill Devil Hill, that reconstructed the Wrights' scientific and engineering studies of heavier-than-air flight.
Harry Combs has a natural affinity for pioneers. I think it doesn't matter whether they're pioneers of the sky or pioneers of the West. I think he identifies with them, and I think he has tremendous respect for them.
Though Combs regularly describes writing as a pain in the ass, after his retirement from Gates Lear in 1982, he threw himself full-time into researching and publishing books about various kinds of pioneers. He wrote a fictional trilogy about the taming of the American frontier, and later published a study of the Battle of the Little Bighorn.
Harry Combs is what is commonly described as a Renaissance man. He is somebody who is equally at home in a corporate environment, but is probably happiest when he is either out riding the range or he is in the air flying an airplane.